Well, hi, everyone. My son is a computer and electrical engineer, and he always gets really freaked out when I try to use any examples involving technology or computer stuff, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's a statement that's used in computer programming called an if-then statement. And if-then statements can handle almost any computation, from processing simple tasks to automating complex workflows. It's called a conditional statement that tells a computer what to do with certain information. It allows programs to make decisions while they're running. If this happens, then do that. If that happens, then do this. It's conditional. So the little thermostat that hangs on your wall at home, it runs a simple program. When you set the temperature for 72 degrees, it's constantly reading the temperature of the air and saying, if the temperature is below 72, then turn on the heat. If the temperature reaches 72, then turn off the heat, and so on and so on. I realize this is a very simplistic way to describe this, but you get the picture. And all the programmers and engineers watching are shaking their heads in embarrassment. But when you think about it, our whole society is built on conditional if-then statements. At a gas pump, if you put an authorized credit card in the pump, then you can fill up your car with gas. If you give the Starbucks barista about $10, then you can get a cup of coffee. We use conditional statements with friends. If you buy lunch today, then I'll buy lunch next time. It's the basis of our employment. If I work these hours, then I will receive this salary. It's the basis of our housing. If you pay $350,000, then you can purchase that house. And transportation. If you pass the DMV test, then you can drive a car. It's the basis of how we interact with our pets. Your cat says, if you feed me, I won't scratch your eyeballs out while you sleep. But most of our society is built around these conditional understandings. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross suggests that if-then statements are also part of the natural grieving process. We said in week 1 that grief involves shock and denial, and we looked at some biblical ways to process that. And then last week, Pastor Scott talked us through how grief also involves anger, and he taught us how to walk through seasons of anger using Psalm 13 as our guide. Today, we're at the third aspect of grief that Kubler-Ross calls bargaining. And she writes this. She says, if anger with God doesn't persuade him to respond to your pleas, then maybe he'll be more favorable if you ask nicely. Bargaining is when we pull out all the if-then statements. If you do this, God, then I'll do that. If you heal my husband, then I promise to go back to church. If you bring my child back to me, then I'll never take another drink. If you give me my job back, then I promise to tithe on my income. Maybe God didn't respond well to my anger, so I'll try the nice approach and see if we can work out a deal, a bargain. Here's the issue. You know, normally if you're bargaining with someone, you each have something that the other one needs. I don't know if you've ever traveled to countries where you can bargain before you buy something. Like here in the U.S., if you go into a Walmart and it says something costs $19.99, you pay $19.99. Like you don't go up to the cashier and say, will you take $10 for this? Right? But in lots of countries, you can do that. But in that scenario, both of you have something of value. You hold the money and the merchant holds the merchandise. You each have something that the other person wants, and so you have bargaining power. True bargaining can only happen between two equals. But when it comes to God, he holds everything. And so what do we do when it feels so hopeless and so helpless? Like he holds all the cards and we hold none of them. Well, that's what I want to look at today. And again, I just feel the need to acknowledge that some of you today are walking through deep grief. The fact that you're here, that's a huge step. And I just want to recognize it and celebrate it and tell you that I love and admire you. You're my heroes of faith. And I truly do believe that God will meet you at your point of need. He promises, if you seek me, you will find me when you seek me with your whole heart. I believe that God is eager to be found by you. He wants you to know him and to know his comfort and to know his grace. And if you're doing everything in your power just to muster the strength to get through, please turn to him. He loves you and his healing is available to you. Even if at this moment it seems really raw and painful. Now, if you're in a season of bargaining, that means that you're at the place where you're just willing to do just about anything to get something back that you lost. Here are some common characteristics of the bargaining stage of grief. It's things like ruminating over what could have been, holding yourself responsible for the circumstances and punishing yourself and worrying and overthinking things, making comparisons to other circumstances, trying to predict the future and assuming the worst, wishing or praying for a different outcome, thinking or saying, what if, or if I only had, or if I do this then. So here's how I'd like to encourage you today. It's our big idea. It's to choose to wrestle with God and not to avoid or isolate. So there are several biblical instances where God seems to engage people in such bargaining tactics. For example, there's Hannah. She grieved her inability to have a son, so she prayed, God, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. And God gave her a son. And then there's Samson. His sin and disobedience resulted in the loss of his supernatural strength, allowing the Philistines to overpower and capture him. And in his most desperate moment, Samson begins to bargain. He asks God to give him his supernatural strength back just one more time. And in return, he would use that strength to bring down the Philistine temple. And God gave Samson his request. But there are also times when great men and women of faith bargained with God, and God didn't even come close to giving them what they asked for. Like we read about Paul, who famously dealt with this thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what it was, but he says, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me. And he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. And guess what? God didn't take it away. Instead, God responded with these words. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so it goes both ways when it comes to bargaining with God. But I want to take us to maybe the ultimate story of bargaining in the Bible. It's the story of Jacob. And I just want to set it up by giving you a little of the backstory. You can turn in your Bible or device to Genesis 32 as I'm setting this up. So Jacob was one of the early patriarchs of the Jewish people. He was in the line of the blessing. God promised Abraham that he would make him a great nation. And so there was Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob. And eventually the entire nation of Israel will be named after Jacob. And so we're at a very important juncture of this story today. And far from a fairy tale, Jacob's life was characterized by deep-seated family hostility. This was not a happily ever after deal. He was a ruthless man. He was a con artist. He was a liar and a manipulator. He grabbed his brother Esau's heel coming out of the womb. He was deceiving from the start. And eventually he deceived his father and maliciously stole his brother Esau's birthright. Jacob's life had been filled with never-ending wrestling and deceiving. And as a result, he was filled with fears and anxiety. Right before today's text, he had been manipulated by his father-in-law, Laban. And so he took all of his family and all of his possessions, this is Jacob, and he fled the scene. And his father-in-law chased him down, and they had a bitter confrontation. And just as that confrontation ended, he received word that his embittered brother, Esau, whom he had cheated from childhood, was on his way to confront Jacob, and he was bringing an army with him. And so anxious for his life, Jacob concocted a plan. He sends all his possessions, along with all of his family members and children, across the Jabbok River in hopes of bribing and pacifying his brother. His weaseliness continues. And so here in our story today, Jacob is physically and emotionally exhausted. He's alone in the wilderness. He's at odds with his father-in-law. He's facing certain death at the hands of his angry brother tomorrow morning. He's thinking, this is karma. This is a lifetime of cheating and deceit all coming down on my head, all in this moment. And in this moment, alone and agonizing, I think Jacob is grieving. Why? You may say, what has he lost? Well, his whole life was a string of terrible decisions. And he's just given up all of his worldly possessions and all of his remaining family relationships, and he sent them across the river. And so, yeah, he lost a lot. And anxiety and exhaustion are finally overtaking him, and he collapses, too tired to struggle any longer. One other detail. Jacob is 97 years old, so just file that away as this scene unfolds. So I want you to look at Genesis 32, starting in verse 22. It says this. It says, the same night he arose and he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 children. He crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and he sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. I just want to dwell on that detail for a moment. Verse 24 says he's left completely alone. And so just put yourself in his shoes. He's 97. He just parted with everything that he'd ever cared about. There's absolutely nothing left. I think he thought this is the end. His brother is going to show up in the morning for paybacks. And so here he was alone. He's at the end of his rope. He's at the end of himself. He had nothing else to cling to. And guys, listen, when you're at the end of yourself, that's when God does his best work. And some of you are there right now, and you feel alone, and you feel helpless. You feel like you've tried everything. You feel like you've lost everything important. You've cried all the desperate tears. Your feelings are almost numb at this point. Don't lose hope. Your struggle may not be over just yet, but don't lose hope. Look at verse 24. It says, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And so this mysterious man shows up. Who is this mysterious man? The wrestling partner of Jacob. Well, the original Hebrew is non-committal. It just means an individual, a stranger. But at the end of the episode, we get a little clue. Jacob calls him Elohim, which is translated God, but the Hebrew can also be used for any supernatural being. The clearest statement probably comes in another Bible book in Hosea 12:4, where the prophet indicates that Jacob struggled with an angel. Since an angel can legitimately be referred to as Elohim, that may be the most reasonable explanation, that he wrestled with an angel, but some designate that was sent by God. We find out later that Jacob realizes that whoever it was, that this wrestling match was actually with God himself. And so they wrestled all night. And finally, this mystery man, this angel, says, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what's your name? He said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. So for the rest of our time, here's what I'd like us to do. I'd like us to learn 3 lessons from biblical bargaining. The first is this. Let's normalize wrestling with God during grief. So I gave you my little rant in week 1 about stuffing your emotions and pretending it's faith. So I don't need to rehearse that again. But there is so much pressure, isn't there, to be okay all the time. Like our social feed needs to show that we're happy and pretty and well-adjusted, and we live in a culture that just celebrates victory and power and strength and confidence and progress and prestige. And we despise things like fear and weakness and failure and doubt. We know that a measure of vulnerability and discouragement comes with just like having a normal life, but we tend to view these things as signs of failure and maybe even a lack of faith. And the story of Jacob pulls us back to this reality that it's okay to wrestle during seasons of grief. Let's normalize it. I tend to agree with theologian Paul Tillich, who said, doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is one element of true faith. And so when you're in grief, you're going to wrestle either way. The important thing is to wrestle with God. Don't wrestle without God through your grief. And why not just go straight to the source with your questions and your frustrations? Like you don't go to the grocery store clerk and ask them your computer questions. You don't go to your banker and ask them home repair questions. By the way, you also shouldn't take your home repair questions to your friend who has the same home repair problems as you do and hasn't figured it out yet. Yet some people do this with their doubts. Like some doubters only ask their question to fellow doubters and grievers to fellow grievers. Go ask someone who might be able to help you find an answer. Go to the source. Wrestle directly with God about it. Notice Jacob was very clear. He put words to what he wanted. He says, I want you to bless me. If you bless me, then I'll let go. See, the opposite of bargaining is not faith. The opposite of bargaining is avoiding or isolating. And Jacob doesn't do that. He goes straight to God and he puts words to it. You see, putting words to our complaints allows for an opportunity to redirect our hearts. Rather than allowing these painful circumstances to rule us or create bitterness or despair in us, we just say it out loud or journal it. The more specific, the better. These frustrations, when they're expressed, they push us further toward God and not away from him. You may wonder, well, how did this angelic being not prevail in a wrestling match with a tired old 97-year-old man who had no, backup? Well, I think we're supposed to understand that this wasn't just a physical wrestling match. The clue is in the detail that one touch from this stranger dislocated Jacob's hip. Although again, at 97, your hip could pop out with a strong gust of wind. You mature saints know what I'm talking about. But anyway, the detail points us to the fact that he's wrestling spiritually and emotionally. Like if it was a physical wrestling match, it would have been over before it started, but it wasn't. God is up to something. And the something is healing. He's up to something holistic. He's up to something spiritual in the wrestling. Jacob makes his request, and then all he can do is hold on for the ride with everything he has all night. So let's normalize wrestling with God. But the second lesson I want you to see about biblical bargaining is this. It's to let your persistence deepen your faith. So God responds to our persistent requests. You don't need to beg him as if he doesn't know what's going on. That there is nothing that has happened to you that caught God by surprise. He didn't step out for a cup of coffee and come back and be like, oh man, what happened to Derek while I was away? No, he has allowed the things to come to pass in your life, and he will walk with you through them in pure love and devotion. But as you're contending with God in your grief, it's also important to not give up, to be persistent. Verse 26, Jacob says, I will not let you go. Jesus once said that prayer is like an old poor widow who needed justice on something but couldn't get the judge to pay attention to her because she was poor and she couldn't afford a lawyer or to bribe him. And so she goes to his house day and night and wears him down through her persistence. Whenever he's trying to sleep, she's like, knock, 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 judge. Every time he goes in or out, she's like, hey, have you had a chance to look at my case yet? Finally, he says to himself, these are Jesus' words, not mine. I don't care a thing about this woman. I don't care a thing about justice, but this woman has flat out worn me down, and so I'm going to give her what she asks. And then Jesus says, that's what prayer is like sometimes. Like this is one of those stories that I'm super glad that Jesus told and not me. But what's he trying to say? I mean, this story is clearly not painting a picture of God's heart. God cares deeply about his children, and he loves justice. The cross shows you that he absolutely does. So this is not a story about God's character. What's it about? It's about persistence. He's trying to say that praying sometimes feels like that. Like you're calling and no one's answering. Like you've texted and you just get that endless loop of the 3 dots in response. God sometimes seems indifferent and he seems uncaring to us. Like he's not listening. Ever had that experience? If not, you're lying in church. So Jesus says, be persistent in your requests, but make sure that persistence is directed toward God. You know, sometimes in our grief, we persist in the wrong things. We persist in solving the mystery. We persist in trying to make sense of our circumstances. We persist in becoming, detectives and trying to track down why this thing happened to me. Persistence is good, but direct it toward God, because only then will it deepen your faith. There's an interesting play on words in Jacob's story. You can't really see it too easily in the English, but in the Hebrew, the irony comes out. It's in verse 24, it says, the stranger wrestled with him. But in the Hebrew, it literally says that a man came and Jacobed with Jacob. The name Jacob is the word for wrestle. And so the reason Jacob's name is wrestle is because that's his whole life. He was a grappler, someone who was always trying to get the upper hand, trying to jockey for position, trying to get the advantage, always out to strive and attain. He was a conniver. He was a schemer. But who was he wrestling with his whole life? Do you know what Jacob would say? Jacob would say, it's Esau. Jacob would have said, the problem of my life is that I've had to wrestle with this brother of mine, Esau. I wrestled with him in my mother's womb. I wrestled with him for the birthright. I wrestled with him for my father's favor. I wrestled with him for the leadership of the family. Esau is the problem of my life. He's the reason I haven't been able to have the life that I wanted to have. He's the one who stood between me and my happiness, between me and my joy, between me and my honor and my love. He is the one who has become between me and my ideal life. I've been wrestling with Esau, and I'm about to face him down tomorrow when he shows up over that horizon. Now, in the middle of the night, there's a new wrestling partner. Why? You know what God's saying? He's saying, hey, Jacob, I got news for you. Your problem is not Esau. I'm the one you've been wrestling with your whole life. Like you thought the climax of your life is going to come tomorrow morning. It's tonight. Like you thought tomorrow you're going to meet the person you've been wrestling with all your life. You thought tomorrow you were going to meet the person that you've had a big problem with in your life. Oh, no. Tonight is when that's going to happen. God's saying the problem beneath all of your problems is that you've been wrestling with me. You've been resisting me. You've been trying to fight with me. You've been trying to kick me out of your life. But you wanted to be your own Savior. You wanted to be your own Lord. You wanted to be the solver of all your own problems. And so during the wrestling match, all of a sudden Jacob comes face to face with this reality, this hole in his heart, this loss, this grief, all the conniving for his father's approval, all the deception for, to land his wife Rachel. He had been looking for blessing in this and in that. And in this moment, he realizes, God, you're the only source of blessing. And when he realizes it, he says, I'm not going to let you go. This is where Jacob goes from being a person who knows about God to knowing God. And it happens in his pain. See, at the beginning, Jacob was fighting off this mysterious being. Now he won't let him go because his faith has deepened. He's come to understand, God, if I don't have you, I don't have anything. Like you're the only one who can fix me. I can't go back to Rachel. I can't go back to Esau. I can't go back to my father. I can't go anywhere. Because I realize now that all of these things will never satisfy me. I get it now. I see it now. So no, I'm not going to let you go. Regardless of what the conditions are, I will not let you go unless you bless me. He was persisting now in the right place after persisting his whole life in the wrong places. So his persistence with God becomes the turning point of his faith. And I pray that same thing for some of you today. Don't give up in your persisting. Don't give up in your praying. Don't give up in your contending and your crying out. Like your moment of pain may be the very moment that you see God finally for who he really is, where your faith in him is cemented like never before, where you can honestly look in your grief and say, I may never get that thing back in this lifetime, that thing that I lost, that job, that opportunity, that person. But God, I get you, and that's enough. Which leads to the third thing that I want you to see about biblical bargaining. You may not get what you asked for, but you may get something better. And one of those better things is a new identity. See, you may find that your struggle, that your bargaining hasn't changed God's plan, but it has changed your identity in him. In verse 28 for Jacob, the blessing comes in the form of a new name. The turning point comes when the mysterious being asked Jacob, what's your name? What's your name? And I wonder if, he felt self-conscious about this when he said, my name is Wrestling Sneaky Deceiver. Can you imagine if you had to introduce yourself by your worst sin? Like, hi, I'm Liar. Nice to meet you. Hi, yeah, you can just call me Adulterer. Wouldn't that be terrible? But listen to what happens. This mystery man says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed. The old deceiver, Jacob, has now become the new Israel. And this is the first time we see this word, this name, Israel, in the whole Bible. It literally means strives with God. And so Jacob receives a broken hip, but he also receives a whole new identity. And notice, he could have said, like the ting-tings, that's not my name, and just kept walking in his old ways. But this moment truly changes Jacob. He has a new identity. He begins to walk in a new calling and a new relationship with God. He enters into this new identity. But the second part of the verse is where we truly get the better thing. God declares, this is crazy, but God declares a winner of the wrestling match. Did you hear it? He said, you wrestled with God and you won. Now, just imagine that scene for a second. First of all, he's a 97-year-old guy who was awake all night. That in itself is not pretty. He has been alone in his weakness, in his fear, in his panic, now with a broken hip. His whole life has been fighting with God. He's been fighting with everyone else. He's been a con artist, a really terrible person. And there he lays in the tent, holding on for dear life, utterly crippled, completely powerless. And God stands over him, reaches down, picks up his right arm and holds it in the air and says, winner. What? How can God say winner to a loser? How can God say good to a bad? Jacob is completely perplexed by it. How is this possible? Well, we all know that this divine being could have won. We saw how easy the hip thing was. He could have just incinerated Jacob in a millisecond. So what happened? God knew that if he had won the wrestling match, he would have lost Jacob's heart forever. And what God actually wanted in this encounter was a changed heart, a changed life. He wanted an awakening. And so he lost. He failed in order that they might both win in the end. You see, the outcome of your bargaining with God may not be the resolution that you're looking for. You'll probably never get that thing back that you lost, that you so desperately want restored to you. But you may find a relationship with God in the process, and that is truly the blessing you seek, whether you know it now or not. That's the win-win. See, God shows us that what looks like defeat to our human eyes is actually victory in God's eyes. So to finish the story, after Jacob's wrestling match, the encounter with this estranged brother Esau the next morning goes amazingly well. What was supposed to be a deadly showdown melts into tears and hugs. And after all that drama, tucked away in this little chapter 33, verse 20, is this tiny little verse that says, "And there he erected an altar, and he called it El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel." And so right after the wrestling match and the deliverance, this man, now named Israel, used to be Jacob, now named Israel, built an altar, and he called it the God of Israel. In other words, my God. Up to that point, Jacob had referred to God differently. In 32 verse 9, he was praying and he said, "O God of my father, Abraham, O God of my father, Isaac." Go back another chapter, 31:42. During the encounter with his father-in-law, he says, "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed." Here's the insight. God is the God of Abraham, and God is the God of Isaac, but Israel did not say that God was his God until after he wrestled with God, until he had a very personal struggle with God. His faith was not cemented. It was not his own. He knew of his father's faith. He had certainly heard the stories of his grandfather's faith, but it wasn't solidified in his life until he made it his own in this very personal encounter with God. Guys, in your bargaining, you may not get what you ask for, but you may get something better. God himself as your God. And God has made himself available to you much in the same way he did to Jacob. Here in Genesis 32, we get a glimpse of Jesus. Even though you may be crumpled up on the floor in the middle of your tent, in your grief and your loss and your pain, feeling alone, God, your hand has been raised as the victor. You are the winner because God chose to lose so that we all could win. Why is Jacob in the end actually the victor? Because when he was utterly weak, when he didn't understand what God was doing, all he knew was, I'm going to hold on. I'm going to persist. I'm not going to stop serving you. I'm not going to stop seeking you. I don't feel good. In fact, I don't feel anything at all. I feel nothing but pain, but I'm going to hold on. And God says, you win. Hold on to him even when things feel incredibly bleak and you feel incredibly weak. Remember how he took the ultimate weakness for you on the cross. Think about what he did for you and then hold on. And somehow your weakness will be turned to strength. This is the fight of your life, some of you guys. And in this fight, ironically, to surrender leads to ultimate victory. Let me just remind you of two things today before we go into our practice of lament. There are two next steps. The first is, we've just been saying, find a group, especially during times of grief. You just need people around you. We're better together, we're stronger together, and now is a great time to explore this. And we have groups that meet in homes all over the region. So would you check out life groups at our website for more information? And second, if you're in the Erie area, we have a worship night coming on Wednesday, October 19th in Grace Harborcreek. These have proven to be filled with hope and life and healing as we cry out to God collectively. So I hope to see you there. You know, we talked about borrowing the language of the Psalms as we practice lament. And so we're going to do that again today as we turn to Psalm 10 as our guide today. And we're going to talk specifically about making complaints to God. I read a prayer the other day from a mom who said, God, I know you're not mean, but it feels like you are today. In the Psalms of Lament, you'll find a lot of creative complaining like this. And I think there's a right way to do it. I'm no advocate of self-centered raging at God when life didn't turn out you planned, like a spoiled little person. Although I'm sure God's big enough to handle that too. But a good complaint starts and ends with the promises of God. It's communicating back to God the fact that you don't think he's fulfilled what he promised. It's holding him to what he said. So as we get better at proper complaining, I think it keeps us, on the one hand, from wallowing in kind of a self-made prison of despair and bitterness. On the other hand, it keeps us from stoic denial and isolation, which is what we talked about today. So Stacy Gleddy-Smith provides a helpful explanation of a complaint within lament. She says, it honestly and specifically names a situation or circumstance that is painful, wrong, or unjust. In other words, a circumstance that does not align with God's character and therefore does not make sense within God's kingdom. So we complain on the basis of our belief in who God is and what he can do. So with that in mind, your host is going to come now and walk you through the ancient practice of lament, specifically learning to complain the right way. I love you guys.